Let's start by looking at a pretty standard implementation of fetch to connect to an external API. In this case, we're going to use the randomuser.me API. This just gives us a set of data about a random person. This is good for prototyping applications where you don't have real user data yet, but this will simulate pretty realistic user data. So I'm so far just setting up some variables. In this case, I've got the base API URL. I've got one of my query parameters, and then I've put these together to build a string. Next, I'm going to go ahead and initiate a fetch, and I'm going to pass in that URL as my parameter. Now, with this API, I'm only going to be doing a GET request, but just for the sake of completeness, I'll go ahead and create an options configuration and set the method to get. Like I said, this is the default, so I don't really need to do this, but it's good to get into the habit of becoming familiar with configuration options. Now this is going to perform the actual request on that URL with those options. When it finishes, it'll pass that response back into our then and our catch methods. So we'll worry about the then first. Then's going to take a callback function. In this case, I will pass in the response, and then I can use that response in any way I like. Note that this arrow function only has one argument, so I can in fact remove those brackets. And in here, I need to return this response transformed into JSON into the next then statement. So the way that I'm going to do that is with return response.json, and that will allow me to access it in the next then. So in this case, I'll access data, and then I can do whatever I want with the data in here. We'll get back to that in a moment. Now, if an error had occurred anywhere up to this point, it would be swallowed by this fetch method. So instead, what I need to do is create a catch that checks for errors. And then in this case, I'll just console log out the error message if one occurs. While we're here, let's console log data. And let's see what this looks like so far. We can see that I've got a fetch finish loading, a GET request, and I have my console logged results. This API has sent me back an info object with some information. It's also sent me back a results array of objects, and each object has information about that fake user. I could then loop through this results array and populate the DOM with this information. If we go back to here, we can actually clean this up a tiny bit. Our arrow function up here is a little verbose. If we were to remove these curly braces and remove the return statement, the shorthand version of that is this, where we simply have our arrow function, which is equals and the greater than sign. And if we have no curly braces, the default would be to return whatever this value is. So in this case, response is turning into JSON. It's becoming data. And we could call this whatever we want. We could call it parsed response. We could call it cats. Doesn't really matter. And then we can utilize it down in here. Now it's important to keep in mind that catch is going to catch the most recent error above it. So for instance, if our error occurred up here before response.json, and then it caused response.json to fail, the only error that we would see is response.json. So you could put catches between every possible then block, and that would basically just watch. That can be a bit overly verbose. You might want to handle some of your error handling inside. So for instance, if we know that our fetch is expecting our response to be a certain way, we can instead perform a condition inside here. So perhaps we want if response.ok, then we return response.json, else throw response. And this will throw an error, which will in turn skip over our then and go straight to the catch. This is useful for making sure that your response doesn't have any errors, even if it technically is successful. So you can check for the OK status, and the OK status will be flagged as true if any of the HTTP codes that are accepted as a successful action are returned to you. So let's go ahead and try that again in the browser. And we shouldn't see any changes. And we don't. We look at the network tab and we look at all our requests. Rather than console logging out, we can even inspect it right here. So I can see there's my GET request to the API. And I can go ahead and browse this. I can even look at the response itself. I can look at the headers, see what's happening in here. And this is a great way to avoid console logging. So for instance, if I go back into here and I comment this out and refresh the page, we no longer have that in our console, but my network request will still show it, and I can browse the shape of that response in here without any problems.